Most people assume procrastination is a problem for the lazy, the unmotivated, the undisciplined, the ones who simply don't care enough to get started. But psychologists who study high achievers have found something strange. The smartest people in the room are often the ones who wait the longest to begin. Brilliant students, talented professionals, people with the skill to finish a task in an afternoon instead spend weeks avoiding it. And the reason has almost nothing to do with motivation. It has to do with what the brain is actually trying to protect. By the end of this, the entire idea of procrastination as laziness will fall apart. Because the real story is about fear, identity, and a mental defense mechanism so well disguised that even the person using it has no idea it's happening. For decades, the explanation for procrastination seemed obvious. A person delays a task because they don't want to do it. They lack discipline. They need better time management, a stricter schedule, a louder alarm clock. Self-help culture built an entire industry on this assumption. Productivity gurus sell systems. Calendar apps promise structure. Habit trackers promise accountability. The underlying message is always the same. Fix the behavior, and the procrastination disappears. But researchers studying real procrastinators noticed something that didn't fit. The people procrastinating the most weren't always the least capable. Often, they were the most capable people in the room. Gifted students missed deadlines on projects they were fully equipped to finish early. High-performing employees delayed presentations they had the skill to deliver flawlessly. Talented writers stared at blank pages for months, even when the ideas were already fully formed in their heads. If procrastination were simply about laziness or lack of skill, this pattern made no sense. Something deeper was going on, and to understand it, the story has to go back to a discovery that changed how psychologists think about avoidance altogether. In the late 1970s, psychologists Stephen Berglas and Edward Jones ran a study that would quietly reshape the understanding of human self-protection. They gave participants a test, then told them, falsely, that they had performed extremely well. Then came the twist. Before a second test, participants were offered a choice. They could take a drug that would enhance their performance, or one that would impair it. Logically, anyone who wanted to succeed again would choose the performance enhancer, but many participants chose the one that would make them perform worse. At first glance, this looks irrational. Why would someone deliberately sabotage their own success? Berglas and Jones realized the participants weren't protecting their performance, they were protecting their identity. If they took the enhancing drug and failed anyway, that failure would say something terrifying, that they simply weren't capable. Their first success would be exposed as luck, not skill. But if they took the impairing drug and failed, the failure had an explanation. It wasn't a reflection of their ability. It was the drug's fault. This phenomenon became known as self-handicapping, and it explains something that productivity advice almost never addresses. Sometimes avoiding effort isn't about avoiding work. It's about avoiding the verdict that effort might deliver. This single discovery cracked open an entirely new way of understanding procrastination, particularly among high achievers. For someone who has built an identity around being smart, capable, or talented, the stakes of trying are completely different than they are for someone with nothing to lose. If a person believes they aren't particularly skilled, failure simply confirms what they already expected. It stings, but it doesn't threaten their sense of self. But for someone whose identity is built on competence, failure threatens something much bigger than the outcome of one task. It threatens the entire self-concept. So the brain does something clever and almost completely invisible to the person experiencing it. It delays the task long enough that, if the result isn't perfect, there's already a built-in excuse. I didn't have enough time. I was rushing. I could have done so much better if I'd started earlier. The delay isn't a failure of discipline. It's a psychological insurance policy. This is where procrastination researcher Piers enters the picture. After analyzing decades of research across thousands of participants, Steele developed what's known as the Procrastination Equation, a formula describing the psychological forces that determine whether a person will delay a task. One of the most powerful variables in that equation isn't laziness at all. It's the size of the perceived threat tied to the outcome. The higher the stakes feel to a person's identity, the more likely the brain is to avoid starting. This explains why the most capable people are often the most vulnerable to this pattern. The better someone is at something, the more pressure exists to maintain that reputation. A mediocre result from someone who has been labeled average barely registers. But a mediocre result from someone labeled brilliant feels like exposure. So the brain doesn't see the blank document, the unfinished proposal, or the looming deadline as simply a task. It sees a potential threat to identity. And the nervous system responds to identity threats the same way it responds to physical ones. It avoids them. This is the part almost nobody talks about. Procrastination isn't a failure of logic. It's an emotional regulation strategy. Neuroscience backs this up. Brain imaging studies on task avoidance show heightened activity in the amygdala, the brain's threat detection center, when people anticipate working on tasks tied to ego or self-worth. The brain isn't asking, "Can I do this?" It's asking, "What happens to how I see myself if I try and it isn't good enough?" And when that question feels dangerous enough, avoidance becomes the most logical response the brain can offer, even if it looks irrational from the outside. This reframes the entire experience of waiting until the last minute. The student who starts the essay at midnight isn't disorganized. They're managing fear in the only way their mind knows how. The employee who delays starting the big project isn't unmotivated. They're protecting a self-image that feels fragile under real scrutiny. The freelancer who can't open the file for their most important client isn't undisciplined. They're avoiding the moment their work gets measured against their own impossibly high internal standard. This is why procrastination correlates so strongly with perfectionism, not laziness. Researchers studying perfectionist tendencies have repeatedly found that people with the highest standards for themselves often procrastinate the most, not the least. It seems backwards until the mechanism is understood. A perfectionist isn't avoiding effort. They're avoiding the gap between the result they imagine and the result they fear they'll actually produce. As long as the task remains unstarted, that gap stays purely theoretical. The work is still perfect in their mind because it hasn't been tested against reality yet. The moment they begin, that fantasy becomes vulnerable. So the brain delays the collision between imagination and reality for as long as possible. This pattern produces a strange and exhausting cycle. The closer the deadline gets, the more anxious the person becomes. But that anxiety doesn't usually push them to start sooner. It often pushes them deeper into distraction because the emotional discomfort of facing the task has now combined with the discomfort of running out of time. Only when the deadline becomes unavoidable does a new feeling take over. Urgency strong enough to override the fear of failure. This is why so many high performers report doing their best work under pressure. It's not because pressure actually improves their performance. It's because pressure is the only force strong enough to silence the fear that was blocking them in the first place. Once the deadline removes any possibility of perfection, the pressure to protect that perfect imagined outcome disappears. There's no more room for the fantasy version of the work. There's only the real version, finished under pressure. And paradoxically, that final product is judged as good, reinforcing the belief that waiting until the last minute is simply how they work best. In reality, the deadline isn't unlocking hidden potential. It's removing the psychological threat that was suppressing it the entire time. This creates long-term consequences far beyond a single missed deadline. People trapped in this cycle often begin to build their entire identity around the idea that they work best under pressure, reinforcing avoidance as a permanent strategy rather than recognizing it as fear in disguise. Over time, this leads to chronic stress, lower quality decision-making, and a nervous system that stays activated far longer than necessary because nearly every important task becomes associated with last-minute crisis management. It also quietly damages confidence in a way most people never notice. Each time a task is completed under extreme pressure, the brain learns that competence is something that has to be rescued at the final moment, rather than something that can be trusted from the start. This is the hidden cost of high-achiever procrastination. It isn't just lost time. It's a slow erosion of the belief that ability can be relied upon calmly without crisis as a prerequisite. So what actually breaks this cycle? Psychologists studying this pattern point to a single, counterintuitive shift. The goal isn't to fix discipline. It's to lower the emotional stakes of starting. High performers who successfully overcome this pattern don't do it by trying harder to just start. They do it by removing the threat the brain associates with starting in the first place. This often means deliberately giving themselves permission to produce a bad first attempt. Not a good one. Not an impressive one. A genuinely bad one. This sounds counterproductive, but it directly disarms the self-handicapping mechanism. If the goal of the first attempt is to be imperfect, failure is no longer a threat. It's the expected outcome. Once that threshold is crossed, momentum takes over because the hardest psychological barrier was never finishing the task. It was beginning it. This is the real productivity lesson hidden inside the science of procrastination. The most capable people don't struggle to start because they lack ability. They struggle because, somewhere in their mind, starting feels like placing that ability on trial. The cure isn't more pressure, more deadlines, or more willpower. It's removing the verdict from the act of beginning, so the brain no longer treats the first step as a threat to be avoided. Because in the end, procrastination was never about the task. It was never about time, vice, or laziness, or poor planning. It was about protecting an identity from a question it was too afraid to answer. And the moment that question stops feeling dangerous, the waiting finally stops too. There's a reason this pattern shows up so consistently in classrooms, in offices, and in the lives of people who, on paper, have every reason to succeed without hesitation. Educational psychologists have tracked this phenomenon for years inside academic settings, where the stakes of identity feel especially sharp. A student who has spent a lifetime being called the smart one doesn't experience an assignment the way an average student does. For them, every grade is quietly read as a referendum on their entire identity. So instead of starting early and risking a result that might contradict that label, the brain finds a way to keep the label intact for as long as possible. Waiting becomes a strange form of self-protection, disguised as carelessness. The same pattern appears in workplaces, especially among employees who were hired specifically for their talent. The pressure to perform at the level that got them the job in the first place can become paralyzing, because anything less doesn't feel like an off day. It feels like proof that the hiring decision was a mistake. This is the quiet, invisible weight that high achievers carry into every new task. Not laziness, not disorganization. A constant, low-level negotiation between ambition and fear. Understanding this changes the entire conversation around productivity advice. Telling a chronic procrastinator to just start ignores the actual mechanism driving the behavior. It's the equivalent of telling someone afraid of heights to simply walk to the edge of a cliff. The instruction isn't wrong, but it completely misunderstands what's actually happening beneath the surface. Real behavioral change requires addressing the fear directly, not the symptom it produces. This is why some of the most effective interventions studied by psychologists don't focus on time management at all. They focus on reducing the emotional cost of an imperfect attempt. One method involves intentionally lowering the bar for the first version of any task to an almost absurd degree. Not a rough draft, a deliberately bad one, a single, ugly paragraph instead of a polished introduction, a messy outline instead of a structured plan. This works because the brain's resistance isn't actually about effort, it's about exposure. A bad first attempt created on purpose removes the possibility of public failure because failure was never the goal to begin with. Once that first imperfect version exists, something shifts. The task is no longer a blank, judgment-laden unknown. It's something real that can be improved, revised, and shaped, which feels entirely different to the brain than creating something from nothing under the threat of evaluation. This single shift, more than any productivity app or time-blocking method, is what allows high achievers to finally break the cycle of waiting until the last possible moment. It isn't a trick for becoming more disciplined. It's a way of telling the brain that beginning is safe, long before the outcome is ever known.